Hello everybody, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on the next in the series on developing a natural capital plan for East England. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes, but for just to confirm you're in the right place, this one's going to be about giving you some feedback on the process that we're currently knee deep in of reviewing your actions and objectives. So we will hover around and wait and watch this beautiful set of logos until we've got kind of a decent quorum, and then we'll crack on. So those of you just joined us are in the right place. We're going to be having this webinar this afternoon, give you some feedback on the objectives and actions we've received from everybody and what we're doing to process it. This session is going to be more interactive than usual. I'm going to talk for a bit and reflect some things, but I think this is going to be quite an important point for people to ask questions and generally quiz us on what we've been up to. So hopefully everything will be nice and transparent. Yeah, we can clear up anything that anyone wants reviews. So we're just going to hang around a bit until we've reached a slightly higher number of participants. We're expecting a few more. And in a minute or two, we'll crack on. Oh, right, we're just on 2 o'clock. Okay.
Yeah, just been 1 minute, Sam, I reckon.
So welcome everyone who's just joined us. You're in the right place for the third in the series of these webinars on developing a natural capital plan for Eastern England. Today we're going to be giving you a bit of feedback about the things you guys have been telling us and talking to you about how we're processing your submissions and how we're going to include your actions and objectives in our analysis. I reckon we'll crack on in a couple of minutes. Where are we at? Yeah, 1 more minute, I reckon, and get going. Right, jolly good. I think that's probably enough to be getting on with. So, welcome everybody. My name's Sam Sinclair. I'm one of the directors of Biodiversify, and as I've now said a number of times, we're going to be having a little session today about the objectives and actions that you've submitted to us and some feedback on how we're reviewing and assessing these and including them in the analysis. This is also an opportunity for questions, so ask any and all questions as we go. And yeah, it should be a fairly simple one today, I think. Nothing too complex. Right, so this is just to remind you very quickly where we're at in the process. We've been collecting people's projects. We've had a large number of very interesting discussions with people about various different projects that we're keen to see included in this planning process. We're right in the middle of the actions and objectives phase, knee deep, in fact, as it were. And then early next year, we'll be moving on to addressing targets. And then after that, in February onwards, basically, it starts to get very interesting because then we'll have the first versions of the plan out, where it will be a space for some very engaging discussions, I suspect. Rachel Dyson, I believe, is going to join us in February. Nancy is dealing with that, so I'm sure she'll let me know what's going on there at the appropriate time. Right, so to crack on, first of all, thank you very much for all of those of you who sent in submissions. We've received a wide range already, which is really exciting. Just an enormous amount of content of all kinds of forms, from county councils, wildlife trusts, water companies, but then a ton of other organisations of different natures and formats and origins. We've received an even larger number of emails and questions and phone calls. My inbox is carnage. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's really exciting. It's been an interesting one. I'm very glad I put my phone number out there, but I have had some fascinating calls with people whilst juggling my 1.5-year-old, which has been a novel experience, but I think absolutely a fantastic indication of how engaged people are in this process. So please keep that coming. I'm happy to chat or respond to emails or whatever it is you send in a stage. I kind of think that's all really key to this, getting everyone's input, whatever form it comes in. So a few people have asked me if you know they have something they're wondering about or thinking about submitting and they're not sure, or they're wondering if it's relevant. And my answer is always the same, which is if you're in doubt, submit it. If you have some ideas or if you need to get board approval or something, you can always let us know. If you'd like to give us your input in a confidential way before you get final sign off from someone, depending on your organization's management structures, that's completely okay. If you want to kind of talk through your ideas before it, I've had, like I said, gosh, maybe 15 people who just phoned me out of the blue and talked about things, and that's completely okay. I'd much rather people submitted stuff and then we kind of worked it out with them, because normally it requires a bit of a kind of case-by-case approach. Much rather that happens early on, and then we can make sure we properly include your input in a nuanced way. So yeah, keep that coming. Right, so we are currently working our way through your submissions for objectives and actions. And by we, I actually really mean Drs. Cisa LaRosa and Julia Hayward, who are doing, I must admit, all of the complicated technical lifting on this bit of work. So they are currently knee deep in everything, and we're going to have a draft list out by Christmas. The deadline for this particular round is going to be the end of next week, so next Friday. Any submissions we receive after that, absolutely still part of the process, but we'll be reviewing them in March when the first presentation comes out. And that is because Julia and Cisa needs to have a really clear list going into next year to work on the targets. So please do get any of your thoughts in by that date. So what we're doing at the moment is working very hard to collate all of your inputs into a shorter list. Now, part of this is because this bit of work here, this stage, is where the social and the analytical processes really come together and start to mesh. And what we need to do is develop a shorter list which still represents the full complexity and breadth of your views, but is still short enough to be digested by the analysis. Something we can actually run and a level of complexity that's actually manageable. So the trick of what we're doing now is figuring out how to make these two different aspects of the work link. So what I'm going to be doing now is talking through exactly how we're going to do that. So there are various stages to this process. Step one, of course, is we receive your submission. You send us in some objectives and actions, either in an email or in the Word document or the online template. And the first thing we'll do is we'll assess and adapt your submissions where necessary. Now, what do I mean by this? The key of this stage for us is ensuring that all objectives are regional and appropriate for systematic conservation planning. So these are some real submissions we've had on the left. The first one is decrease pollution in the Waveney catchment. Now this is clearly a really important local objective, but we need to translate it into a regional one. So we need to make it more about pollution across the whole of WRE. We also need to specify what type of pollution they've got there. Now, what we feel is that they're talking about water and air pollution. So our adaptive objective in that instance would be decrease water and air pollution. Now, it may be we've got this wrong. It may be they're talking about noise pollution or light pollution. And as part of that, to deal with these kinds of things, we'll be reporting on all these decisions we make and putting it all up on the website. So more on that later. Some objectives we can just use as they are. So increase the area of native woodland, fantastic. That's a perfect example of a regional objective. We'll just put straight in there. And others we need to kind of repivot. So, one organization has said that one of their objectives is to be carbon neutral by 2027, 2028, which is a fantastic organizational ambition. That's a really great pledge for an entity to be making. But it's not quite a regional objective. So rather, I think the regional objective kind of that they're trying to communicate with that is about sequestering carbon. So the objective is to sequester carbon across the WRE area. And actually, in many cases, so like with this one, this actually presents an opportunity for further discussion. So in this instance, we'll reach out to that organization and go, look, there are going to be opportunities identified by this plan where you might invest in, restoring peatland, re-wetting it, expanding it in order to sequester carbon, which might form a key part of your carbon neutrality strategy. So in many ways, actually, even though this is not entirely what we asked for, it's actually kind of more exciting because they've given us extra information, which is that this plan could contribute to a strategy and a pledge they've already got out there. So fantastic, keep it coming. This is really useful. But just to illustrate how we're going to translate things so they're kind of digestible by the SCP. Obviously, I've also asked for actions, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about them this webinar, but the main thing you need to know really is we're dealing with it in a very similar way. The process we follow is basically the same. The only real difference is that actions are linked to objectives. In many cases, this is obvious, and in other cases, a decision needs to be made. But we'll kind of get into the meat of that a little bit further down the line. So just to illustrate this, if your objective is decrease water and air pollution, we might link that to reducing runoff from farms. Increasing the area of native woodland might be linked to converting farmland to woodland. Sequestering carbon might be linked to restoring peatland. Now, obviously, this quite quickly gets quite complex because multiple objectives can be linked to a single action and multiple actions can be linked to a single objective. So we're going to deal with that complexity at a later date, but for this stage, we're going to process them in the same way as objectives, basically. So coming back to the process, so I've told you how we assess and adapt your submissions where necessary. The next step of the process is categorizing them. So when we categorize objectives, this is what I meant about trying to come up with a shorter list that reflects the full breadth of your submissions. So we might take doubling tree cover, restoring large areas of fen habitats, and increasing the area of chalk grassland, and collate those into a single category, which is establish new habitat. And that category, establish new habitat, includes all of these submissions you've made. Of course, we'll need multiple categories. So, I've got another two here, which is increased landscape connectivity, which comes from that submission right next to it. And then carrying on with a theme of carbon, a category could be just simply sequester carbon. And there may be multiple different objectives that fit within there. We're going to have to make a few choices in how we categorize things. So, for example, increasing the amount of good riparian and wetland associated habitat is one of the submissions we received. Now, this could be interpreted in two slightly different ways. This could be talking about establishing new habitat. So one way of increasing the amount of good riparian habitat would be to establish, convert something from scratch, so farmland or whatever it might be. Or you could take a low quality habitat and restore it to a good quality because they've specified good in there. So in some of these instances, a decision will need to be made about which category could fit in because it's not entirely clear which one it might go into. I think in this instance, and actually in the instance of the one below of restore woodland and forest, what we'd probably do is put it within both categories. But But just to highlight that we all need to make a few decisions like this. But again, wherever we do, we will report on this in a transparent fashion, and I'll talk more about that at the end. The next step in the process is working with the categories. So we need to expand, support, and define them. So what do I mean by this? The categories will be defined by the submissions that are contained within them. So here's a list of objectives that all fit within the category of establish new habitat. So I won't read them all out, but doubling tree cover, restoring fens, grasslands, creating new habitat, stepping stones, increasing native woodland. These are all objectives which fit within that category. So what we'll be doing is taking a massive long list of everything you submit to us and using that to define this larger category. Now, all this happened in a few different ways, but one of the key ways in terms of how we include it in the analysis is data. So here's a quick illustration of that. So I've taken, or rather CISO has taken, 3 of the objectives which fit within that category of establishing habitat: restore fenland habitats, which will draw grassland, and increase native woodland. And here are 3 examples of data from natural England. We've got on the left here data of where fens exist and where there is opportunities for increasing landscape connectivity and ongoing restoration. There's then a set of data in the middle, which is basically the same for grassland. And for those of you that have been to more of our webinars, they'll probably recognize the one on the far right, which is the data, which is a combination of Natural England and Environment Agency about where to plant trees in order to mitigate floods and restore, expand priority habitats. So when we have this list here, what we're doing is going through and finding data that corresponds to the different objectives to try and represent them within the category. So that is kind of what I mean when I say that your submissions will define these categories. Now, of course, there isn't going to be data available for all these things, but because this is an evolving process, we're working with the submissions as they come in. We will have to do our utmost to find a way of representing all your different submissions. Where that's not possible, we will be transparent about that and identify it up front, or where it introduces a level of complexity or uncertainty that we feel is not appropriate, then again, we'll also talk about that. Pretty much the rule for all this is wherever a decision needs to be made, we will convey it. And if you disagree with it, we're very happy to have a chat about it and see if we've, might find a better way through this. So that's how we'll expand, support, and define the categories. Of course, there are going to be other submissions which don't fit neatly into categories. We're getting a wide range of inputs from a wide range of people, and we will deal with these on a case-by-case basis. So I'm just going to read out a few of the ones that have already jumped out to me from the list. We've already got, oh my Lord, maybe in the region of like 90 objectives or something. I can't quite remember the exact number, but it's enormous. So I've pulled out a few that jumped out to me as being ones that we can't deal with in the traditional SCP, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to use them in some way. So one of the ones I loved, again, I'm not going to name who gave this to us because I feel like it's a bit mean at this stage. I don't want to put people on the spot, but I really love this, which is improved dark night skies. So as it happens, I looked a bit more into this and discovered that South Downs National Park has recently obtained dark sky status, which is quite a big deal. It means you can still see the stars and has important implications. Now, this is absolutely not something I had originally thought of to do with this plan, but it is totally something you could use this plan as part of a project to establish or defend dark night skies. So, in this instance, you could identify where there are areas where there are strong opportunities for natural capital expansion and use that as part of a large strategy to inform a discussion about where you might achieve dark sky status. Another one here is providing the context for sustainable and healthy new communities through creating a strategic sense of place. Now, in this instance, I think this is about the way in which we deliver and communicate the final plan, because I see the role of the plan in this instance as brokering these conversations. this might be about conversations with the county councils, who of course, or district councils, of course, have their own statutory processes for dealing with these things. So I don't want to in any way interfere with that or suggest that this would conflict with those. But you could absolutely use this as a way of identifying, well, look, if there are going to be developments in some places, and there's also opportunities for natural capital action, then maybe there is a way to achieve the natural capital outcomes you want, whilst also providing the context for strategic sense of place in new communities. Especially, of course, given we have these biodiversity net gain laws, which are starting to, hopefully, are going to go through Parliament in the near future. Another one here is to create and sustain the environment for Norfolk's successful business sectors to expand. Now, I'm really pleased that someone sent this one in, because this is exactly what Robin and Rachel are working very hard to achieve. This is a plan for natural capital, but it's for the benefit of society and nature equally. And this is this is quite a complex, multifaceted issue. And Robin and Rachel are spending a ton of time speaking to all kinds of different stakeholders and groups about how to support business sectors through this plan. I think it's also worth noting that we had Emma Taylor from New Anglia LEP speak on the first webinar, and she was fantastic and totally got that this is a really clear link to be drawn between these things. And, she is from the local enterprise partnerships. That is absolutely her focus. So I think this is a massive opportunity. And I think in this instance, we'd use that submission as a kind of an indication of the importance of this, and therefore it kind of helps us justify our actions, essentially. Another original submission was to ensure more water is retained on the floodplains for longer. Now, clearly, this is one of these ones which is absolutely the interface between water management and natural capital. And if I'm entirely honest, I don't really know how we'd plan for that. I think that's a question for CISO and Julia to ponder over the next few weeks. But this is also a clear indication of a link between the water planning work that WRE is, of course, central to their identity, and the natural capital planning work. And where things come in like this, which we might not have thought of, this really helps us go, oh, right, well, we're going to have to make sure that we have a think about this. This might be something to consider within the complicated hydrological models that WRE are developing with a wide breadth of partners. And this might be something that we need to talk about specifically. This could even become an agenda item potentially at the workshops that WRE has next year. Although I wouldn't want to guarantee anything, because that's under Steve and Robin to decide that particular one. So that's how we'll deal with submissions that don't neatly fit within categories. And I've mentioned a number of times that we're going to continue to report on this. And I feel like the reporting is absolutely critical. I absolutely don't want anyone to feel like we are going off and making arbitrary decisions. I also don't want people to feel like they don't understand the decisions. I know that, when Archie spoke on our first webinar, one of his key questions was, who is going to make trade-off decisions and how are they going to be made? And I think that my response, and I thought about this since he said then quite a few times, and I think my key response to this has been that where decisions are minor or small or about interpretation, I think that we will make them, but we will make them in an extremely transparent way. So that then if there are any issues or if anyone doesn't like what we've done, we immediately bring it up and discuss it at either in a separate meeting or one of these events. So I think the trick here is where we have made a decision to make it extremely clear what decision we've made, and give the person who might be affected by it, because it was their submission, plenty of opportunity to review our suggestion and come back and refine it if they wish to. So where there are small decisions, we'll deal with them like that. Where there are large decisions, we'll deal with them in workshops. And I think when we come into New Year in February and March, when we start to get really into the kind of, actually putting plans out, then there's going to be a lot more opportunity for kind of a more engaged debate about particular aspects, because I suspect that will bring up, there'll be certain center point issues which will be brought to the surface. Anyway, in the meantime, this is how we're going to report on how we process your submissions. We are going to have a table that looks a lot like this, although possibly not in such nice colors. It'll probably be an Excel table up on the WRE website. And we're still refining this because the submissions are coming in thick and fast at the moment. But on the left-hand side, we're going to have a list of the stakeholders. So you'll be able to go on there and see exactly how we've taken your submission and used it. Some people would like their submissions to be confidential, and that's completely acceptable. In that case, we'll deal with that on a case-by-case basis because there are different reasons of confidentiality. What we'll do then is put the text they've submitted, so unabridged, complete, in its purest form, the text they've submitted. We will then put in the adaptive objectives, so how we've interpreted what they've said, which allows it to be really clear. If we've made a mistake here, fantastic, send us an email, and we'll have a chat and make sure we get it right. We will then list the category, so which category is it going to go into of these different categorizations. But then we'll put some notes in here as well. So if we've unsure about something or we've interpreted something and we reflect that there is room for discussion here, we will reflect that in the notes. And as we progress, we may also start to list the data that we're going to use to represent these different things. Although I don't want to promise that one just yet, because that's going to be quite an involved process. So I'll have to see how that one goes. But so this is going to go up as we progress, and it's going to be a regularly updated thing. Where there are discussions or side conversations or anything like that, we will also include logs in here. But our aim is that at any point, people can come on and figure out exactly how we've structured and created these categories, how we've dealt with uncertainty and interpretation where it was required. And that's true for everyone else's input. What I really want is that stakeholder A, in this instance, is able to go in and see how their contribution has fundamentally shaped the analysis underpins this plan, so that it's not a mystery and their contribution is really clearly a key part of the decision-making process. So we will use your analysis to create, the input to create the analysis. This is going to be an evolving thing because obviously, we have some idea of what you might submit, but there's been plenty of surprises, and I suspect there will continue to be plenty of surprises, which is the strength of such a collaborative process. So we will adapt this based on your input, but it's going to be an evolving process. Your input is also really helpful for helping us identify gaps or address issues. In some cases, we'll have a pretty clear idea how we deal with them. In other cases, we're going to have to do something more innovative. So we're going to have to kind of deal with that as they come. Again, if in doubt, submit something. You can always change your mind later or update your input or edit it in any way, really. For most people, their submission has been a page, maybe 2 pages, maybe 3 pages of A4. So this is very low effort. Other people have just sent us their documents and highlighted some of the text they want included. That's also fine. And like I said, submissions can help guide the process in many different ways. So even if you're not sure, send it in. It's still useful information. I'm sure we'll be able to find a way to include it either in, if not the analysis, in the way we report on the plan, or the different types of functionality that we seek within this project. So I'm going to leave that up there to remind everybody of the various important dates, and I'm going to answer some questions. I haven't been looking at this whatsoever, so I'm gonna allow me a few seconds to catch up. Have we had any? We haven't. Oh, that's easy.
We haven't had any, which is making me slightly nervous.
Yeah, right. That has got to be a first. That suggests either my presentation was terrible or good, but it's unclear as to which at this point. Does anyone have any questions?
What I will say, Sam, is you mentioned how the SCP process might fit into the workshops that WRE are planning for next year. And I had a similar thought. In my mind, the SCP results could potentially feed into the multi-objective decision tool that we use. But obviously that needs to go to Stephen, to Robin to really consider that. But I kind of think, why not? Like, let's do that and go forward in that way, if it makes sense.
Cool. Yeah, it's so this question of how how all these things integrate is a huge one. And I kind of feel like currently half my job is responding to everyone's inputs and making sure we get the best out of everybody. And the other half is figuring out how all these different processes are going to fit together.
Exactly.
And one of the conclusions that I'm starting to reach is, in many ways, that's going to be easiest done once we have all the pieces on the table. You know, when the
Exactly.
first planners come out and we're having the first workshops of WRE and we're seeing the outputs of their hydrological models and all
Yeah.
these kinds of things, I think that suddenly actually it's going to be quite clear how these different things link. And I think in many ways, the easiest thing is just do this really well. Like get this, you know, really thoroughly done, best reliability, make sure it reflects everybody's input and it's really communally driven. And then, you know, if we need to kind of tackle difficult questions of how to interface it, we're starting from a fantastic foundation point. There are complicated conversations about how to link the models. So there are models for hydrological models that plan the consequences of different choices about water management across the WR region. And they produce numbers. And the key number here is the environmental flow number. So this is how much you have to change the management practices of water in order to restore water in the rivers and other water bodies to an environmentally healthy level. And this is something that Robin thinks about a lot, and Steve also, you know, is key on his work on his plate. And there are some complicated conversations going on between Steve and his team and CISO and Julia about how to make these models speak to each other. So how to take numbers from one and put it in the other. And I have to confess, as a social scientist, I do not understand them in the slightest. So that one's going to have to be one that we talk about later on when this stuff has kind of progressed a bit further. And again, like I said, that's going to be a much easier conversation when we have a first version of this plan, because then we can see how to link these things in a kind of clearer way. So yeah, more will come, but we'll have to watch this space for some more complicated things. Oh, okay, some great conversations. Questions here now from Lindsay Hargraves. At what point does a filthy subject of money come into this? Opportunity cost of land, capital costs, and maintenance problems of voluntary and compulsory actions. So the objectives that everyone provides to us will be optimized against a cost layer. And this cost indicates the opportunity cost. So as Lindsay has highlighted, of taking land out of production or of paying someone to go and do something. So these things will be optimized against them to identify where the most cost-effective places for these actions to take place are the priority areas. Now, what this is merely an indication of, if you were to try and undertake a project to deliver these regional objectives, here's the best place to do it. So it will then be up to people in different areas to actually put together the project that will deliver these things. Now, for me, my eye is on the ELMS money, is on the private sector investment in natural capital that's being discussed left, right, and centre right now. And I feel that having a cost-effective plan that is communally developed, that will deliver these benefits that, you know, as has already been raised, for both people but also for the economy, is going to be key to bringing the healthy subject of money into the conversation in a way that's well structured. So you can see that already it's going to be building on these community developed things, and it's not going to get done secretly or behind closed doors or anything like that. And on that note, as Lindsay has put his head above the parapet, one of the things we're really keen to hear more from is from the farming communities. And I appreciate that individual farmers are not going to want to comment on this. That probably, apart from some of the ones really pioneering this stuff, probably isn't the right point of entry, perhaps. But I feel that the contributions that NFU and the CLA and farmer clusters and other groups might make could be really key in making sure that their voice is heard within this. So I'd really like to see more of that. Cool. We've got some more questions coming in. So from Neil Edwards. Sorry, let me read your question quickly and get it in my head, and I shall read it out. Right, so at what point and how do the consequences of an action objective get characterized and play into the wider process? You had an example to convert farmland to woodland. And clearly, whilst that's that's positive for woodland, it might be negative in terms of the loss of farmland. That might be fine if it's poor value or difficult farmland, but different if it's prime farmland. So this is actually kind of the nub of what SCP seeks to do in many ways. It will look to identify where you can deliver cost-effective actions, as I say, and part of that is about identifying where there are synergies. So, like I said, multiple objectives will often link up to one action. So you can plant a tree in one place and you get carbon, but you can plant it in another, you'll get access to green space, water purification, carbon storage, connectivity, landscape resilience, a whole host of benefits. And in some instances, that would suggest that if you were interested in purchasing those services because you were, DEFRA, for example, or a county council interested in improving your resilience to climate change, then actually it's worth paying the big bucks for that. Actually, it's worth converting some of the primary farmland into woodland. Now, of course, this isn't happening in isolation. We're very well aware that there are going to be areas where people are working on productivity and working on maximizing the output of their farmland across the landscape. So bringing these conversations together is going to be an ongoing process. And it's possibly going to require multiple iterations of planning. And I think we're going to have to deal with that as it comes. Like I said, one of the key things this plan does is identify priority areas where if you were to act, you'll get the optimal outcomes. But that's not to say that's in the conversation. Clearly, that have to be discussions with people who have control over the other purposes of the land to make sure that this is something that benefits everybody. But that is one thing that's kind of incorporated by including the cost effectiveness as the opportunity cost, to farmland and as a kind of core part of the analysis. Give an example of how the NFU or CLA can contribute meaningful objectives and actions, given they cannot speak for individual members. Rob, I am so glad you asked this.
Perfect question.
So Rob, of course, you cannot speak on behalf of individual members, but I strongly suspect there are things that the farming community would like from natural capital action. So, all right, one of my favorite examples is increasing landscape resilience to climate change. So obviously this is coming. This is going to mean milder winters. This is going to mean floods. This is going to mean droughts. Now, obviously, those things are not great for farming. That means, more aphids. That means potential problems with water supply. This might be, of course, flooding isn't very good if you're growing potatoes on the field, or at least my suspicion is it isn't. So my strong suspicion is the NFU and CLA will have clearly identified somewhere within their management system environmental services that the farming communities that they represent depend upon. Now, at this point, we're not asking you to speak for individual members, but really to identify, broadly speaking, regional objectives that would benefit these communities. So if you feel that the farming community would benefit from cleaner water, more water, natural pest management, pollination, water retention within the landscape in order to resist droughts, the impacts of droughts, or indeed all the other benefits that one get from soil quality. I had a fascinating conversation with someone who knows a lot about stuff in one of the national parks and whose practical knowledge exceeds mine by orders of magnitude. And he was telling me about the benefit of properly managed hedgerows in increasing the organic content of soil in the surrounding area, which I had no idea about. But so these are the kind of benefits that I think farmers can clearly appreciate, clearly would help them, both in terms of reducing risk, but also in terms of increasing profitability. Flat out helping them make more money because they can produce more food. So these are the kind of things I would love to hear about from the NFU and the CLA. And especially when it comes to the actions, because there might be some actions the NFU and CLA go, look, these are great. These are going to give you benefits. We've tried it. We've trialed it. We know they work. And there might be others where you go, look, this sucks. Like it often gets suggested, but the evidence behind it isn't sufficient. Great. Tell us about this. Help us incorporate this. When it comes to the individual members, the entry point for them might be much later. It might be that actually when the plans start to come out, that might be when individual members start to look at it, because they can actually see if it relates to their area or not. I feel like I'd want direction or guidance in the NFU and CLA on that aspect. And I'd be very happy to work with both and indeed any organisation about how to handle this complexity of representing such a wide constituent base. So I hope that's helpful, Rob. Please feel free to give me a phone this afternoon or anytime if you'd like to talk more about this. Alan Woods, can you list your data sources earlier? If we know what exists already, that can help us work out what might be possible, i.e. feedback in the objectives and actions. Good to see natural England maps of fens existing feasible to restore. What other maps like that have already been done? Great to have a list and refs to where these sources are available. Possibly. I would have to defer to my planning team on that one. I know they have been studiously collating massive sets of data sets. One of the challenges here is that ideally we need to have regionally available data sets. Local data sets definitely have their use, but we need to have data that's consistent across the region. Otherwise, we end up planning for the areas that have the most data, if you see what I mean. So I think the answer to that is yes, but not right now. I hope that's acceptable. If you'd like more of a conversation, again, happy to have one. From Helen Jacobs, can you remind me when the list of adaptive objectives will be available to view on your website, and will there be a deadline for reviewing commenting? So the list of adaptive, or the full list of all of this, will be on the website before Christmas. In terms of the deadline, I would imagine January sometime. I'm going to have to talk to the planning team about that, because they'll have to have about a certain amount of certainty so that they can get on with stuff. I mean, to be honest, the real opportunity for this will be when the plan comes out. That'll be when it's easiest to comment on these things, because I feel like in abstract, the list of objectives is, obviously you can talk about how we've interpreted things, and that's a really crucial part of this. But in many ways, it's not until you see it in the actual plan and the consequences become a lot clearer that we can then start to go, okay, right, there's clearly some missing stuff here. Clearly you've missed out this critical habitat or this critical service or whatever it might be. And so I think there'll be multiple opportunities, especially if you have something specific in mind. And once it's up on the website, anyone can reach out to us at any stage to talk about that. But I feel like many of the most useful conversations about that will happen when we have a plan to share.
We'll send out an email as well to everyone when these things are on the website. We won't stop emailing you. So always keep a lookout for those for the latest updates and things like that.
Something here, you intend to interact on adaptive objectives to ensure a better ownership sentiment. I think what you mean by that is the purpose of interacting about these adaptive objectives to make sure that people I feel more like they have ownership over the process, in which case, yes, that's very much the purpose. What we're trying to do here is take people's submissions and use that to form the basis of the analysis. And of course, there's always going to be a bit of a translation there between the thoughts in which they come, the form in which they come, and the way that it goes into the analysis. So yeah, but absolutely paramount above this is giving people ownership over it. So that's most of the questions. I guess
one more question just in chat.
Okay.
From Richie Crothers. Will Biodiversify cost each of these options? If not, how will they ensure the options are consistently costed so they can be compared equitably?
Right. So this actually is an interesting technical question. So the objectives, sorry, the actions will be costed, but it'll be done in opportunity costs. So the less so much kind of literally what you pay someone, and more to represent, relatively speaking, the opportunity costs to farming or other land uses. There is currently quite an active discussion within Biodiversify about how to achieve this most effectively, because a lot of it depends on the submissions we receive. Probably the simplest way is to have a consistent opportunity map of costs across the whole area that's shared between all objectives, but it might be that we use different ones for different categories. So, if you're not taking land out of production, but you are changing management practices on it, then there might incur different costs. But if that's going to be basically the same as in terms of the relations between different areas as taking land out of production, then actually it might be easy just to have the single cost layer. There might not be much to be gained by choosing different costs. This, to be honest, is going to emerge from the categories. If we get categories that clearly have very drastically different origins in terms of the opportunity costs, then we'll probably have to deal with that in a different way. But if we don't, then simplicity will probably be our friend there. So I guess my question to you now then is, for those of you who haven't submitted something from your organization, are you going to? Do you know how to do this? Rob, are you happy with my answer? Is that helpful? Is anyone else sitting there going, gosh, I don't know how to do this? Or is it starting to kind of take some shape? Responses on the chat would be very appreciated.
Yeah, chat or Q&A. Yeah, go for it.
And I mean, if someone would like to articulate something and who's really struggling with something, we could potentially give you the mic, although that not something we've done before. So if anyone has like a real problem that they'd like to articulate verbally rather than typing out a mini essay, then do indicate that, and we could potentially let you have a little chat.
Yeah, we can do that. We can promote people to panelists to give them the mic.
Yeah. Oh yeah, look, I've just found the allow to talk button.
Any question, big or small, as well. Like, this is a really new process. Am I right in saying, Sam, SCP hasn't been applied in England before?
So yes, that's mostly true. By a strange coincidence, one of our collaborators, Professor Bob Smith at DICE, is trialling it with some of the wildlife trusts in Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, and Oxfordshire, in parallel with this one. Although they're doing quite a different process. It's much more about informing the wildlife trust actions. Cool. Rob said about this later, and Paul has said, yeah, the form we complete this week, they've got to go for external conversations. That's completely cool. I totally appreciate that. For many people, it's not as simple as filling out a piece of paper. It's got to be, there's a process to be followed and observed, and we're kind of very respectful of that, and happy to take stuff as it comes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, perfect.
Right. Well, I'm glad that Rob and Lindsay are happy, and Phil. That is making me feel very pleased with how this is going. I mean, my suspicion is, gosh, we've got 13 minutes left. We may end up wrapping this off early if we don't get any more questions, which is, I don't want to keep people on if we've kind of reached the end of the conversation.
We've had one just coming from Simon.
Jolly good. How will the outputs work in terms of spatial and temporal distributions? As in, we may agree a shared vision, but we know some actions have lead-in times, so maybe uncertainties and dependencies, one action before others. Thinking how we'll link it to delivery in spatial and other terms of using this support bids and plans, especially as some regionally versus local outcomes asked for. So I think that possibly, to make this as clear as possible, we're probably going to put we're going to link this in with the timings of the water resource plan, which is 30 years, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nancy. So this would be kind of roughly what we might hope to achieve over 30 years. But I kind of, I almost feel like the time aspect of this is in some ways a distraction, because it's not really something we can predict about who would act in what order and how long that might take. I think rather what this plan can do is identify what needs to occur, and then it will be up for the people of the East of England, of all these different organisations, to identify, what they think is most important from them. My strong suspicion is this plan will identify regional priorities, and then there'll be county councils and wildlife trusts and water companies, all kinds of people looking at this, going, "Oh, right, well, some of those priorities line up very nicely with my priorities, so I'm going to get cracking on this." And I feel like, in many ways, even though this is going to be one main plan, it's going to be delivered by an enormous number of different people in an enormous number of different ways. So I kind of feel like, actually, I think it's going to be more effective if it indicates the what, and then everybody between them can collectively decide on the when and the how. So yeah, it's a slight side step to that question, but I hope that clears things up a bit.
There's a good question from Andrew. What does the final deliverable look like? Balancing of text, tables, graphical representations, exactly. So people are giving us all the submissions, we're doing all this work, but what's that actually going to look like in the end?
Sure. So a lot of it is going to be about documenting the process. So it's going to be, here are the submissions we received. Here is the kind of terms under which we ask people to send them in. And here is how we've identified the categories of action for what everyone has suggested needs to happen across Eastern England to deliver the outcomes everybody would like. Here are the targets that we've set based on this input, based on the debate that's going to happen early next year. The discussion will happen then. Critical to this, of course, will be a map. It'll be probably 2 maps, which will be identifying, first off, priority parishes for action. And this will be priority parishes for different types or different combinations of action. So it might be expand habitat, restore habitat, manage farmland in a nature-friendly way. Probably we will also include something about what's called selection frequency, which is that identifying how often an area was identified as a priority for action. So this is essentially a heat map of how important different parishes are to delivering these outcomes. And that can often be a really useful tool to help you make decisions where there are other considerations that have come along later. So, if you're looking at where you might want to build houses and you kind of want to build them on one of the priority ones, well, this will help you identify, are there other opportunities for delivering these outcomes? The key thing here, really, I feel, is to deliver something that is easily understood and that has easily understood implications for stakeholders. So we'll probably have kind of a big wealth of sort of technical appendices that shows step by step how everything has gone through and the democratic process we've gone through. But then we'll aim for something that's fairly concise, indicates the kind of the findings and the plan itself. But I mean, really, no one should have any questions about what we've done by the time they've read it. So that's kind of principle to my thinking behind this. You mentioned that ELMS will be one of the ways this objectives and actions might become reality, but this process could identify new innovative business ideas. How these opportunities be shared? For example, more woodland could provide the wood fibre to replace peat use in horticulture, which then also restores peatland or used as biochar to sequester carbon and soils. Well, that is a fantastic point. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key lessons, I did this enormous review of spatial plans like this as part of my PhD, and in fact the biggest review that's ever been done of plans in both theory and practice. And one of the key things that people said, I asked this question at the end of my questionnaire, which was, what was the key lesson, most important lesson you learned in developing your spatial plan? And one of the kind of the most frequent responses that came up was that actually people developed the plan for one reason, And as soon as they started using, as soon as it was out, it was rapidly used for many other uses that they could never have predicted. And I absolutely suspect that's going to be the case here. And that's kind of been pretty foremost in my thinking about how to design it. So that's why we've made it so open. That's why we were so pleased that WF and the Coca-Cola Foundation supported us to allow us to make this kind of broad remit, because I feel like these opportunities for business ideas and conversations that this sparks are going to be absolutely critical. And I think in many instances, this is going to then be something that Water Resources East kind of becomes a hub for, is these conversations about new ideas that, you know, are bringing together different stakeholders across Eastern England to deliver something fantastic and entirely novel. So I think that's probably going to be something that Robin and Rachel are going to be kind of taking the lead on, but of course we'll be part of that conversation. And I think pretty much our consistent thing in this has to be transparency. So when these things come up and when these projects start to come to light, they, you know, by going through WRE as a partner, obviously, I'm pretty sure most of you, if not all of you, are members of WRE. So you have voting rights over WRE and have the right to see what they're up to. So I feel that that transparency is something that should be leveraged to make sure that things that come out of this are transparent.
That's a great point, Sam. And I can, at WR, our worst kind of thing that we can ever hear is, I didn't know about that. Why didn't you tell me about that? It's the worst thing we could ever hear. Rachel's made a really good point. It's worth highlighting how the SCP plan might evolve long term, because it is this adaptive plan as environment policy and business objectives change in the long term. How can the SCP grow with that? SCP process.
Yeah, good point, Rachel. So one of the things worth noting is that once you've developed this stuff, once you've collected everyone's input and created this kind of communally owned analysis, that can be rerun very easily in the future, and that can be rerun using new information. So there's a few different ways this might go. I mean, in most countries where they've done something like this, the plan's iterated every sort of 3 to 7 years. Depending on the context and the usage. But something we might do, for example, is, you know, publish this plan next year, and then there'll be, I suspect, a number of local plans, or I know about a number of local plans happening, which could be nothing to do with us, could be, you know, dealt with in their own way, totally fantastic. And then we could rerun this regional plan based on the outputs of those plans later on down the line, which then identifies, cool, you know, we've got a pretty clear idea of what people want from their landscapes. We can take in the plans from the local areas, whether it's a farmer catchment, a county, or a catchment partnership, and use the information from those to identify, you know, will these collective plans deliver what everybody wants from their landscape, or are there gaps? And what the SCP will do is then find the most cost-effective solutions to addressing those gaps, which obviously then, you know, helps you identify where you might undertake additional plans or additional projects to kind of build upon what's already happening. And that, of course, is going to be a very adaptive thing. If there are projects for biodiversity offsetting or ELMS money or private sector investment in supply chain resilience or whatever it might be, all those things can be incorporated within those plans very easily.
So in theory, the SCP natural capital accounting, when it's an actual tangible map system, could be adapted and go on in perpetuity.
Yeah, don't see why not. That would be the idea, really. Yeah. Especially because you can then use the same SCP, the model behind it, to inform other plans. So if a county council wanted to use this analysis that's built upon all this knowledge and all this input, but to identify local priorities, you can then rerun it at the county level, or indeed a much smaller level, to identify where might they act across their county to deliver their local priorities, which of course is slightly different to the regional ones. You know, for example, there might be really specific things about local access to green space for different communities. Well, great, you can completely, you know, start from the beginning in many ways with the objectives and actions and targets, but building on all this regional knowledge. So that can be a very helpful tool, and you can also use the same tool to answer complicated questions about investment. Say the NFU is looking at identifying where action should take place in order to secure farming communities against how to protect them against the impacts of climate change, and they've managed to secure investment, for example, from some of their organizations that they work with, then you can ask that question. You can go, okay, my interests are planting trees to protect against flooding and to increase water retention. I have this amount of money, X pounds. Where should I spend that money to deliver the outcomes I want? Well, you can ask that question of the analysis, and you can do it in such a way that then lines up very nicely with the regional prioritization. So it'll kind of say, all right, great, you've got this big map of priorities, but which ones in your particular instance, for your particular project, are the ones that you should focus on to get the outcomes you want for your organization or your constituents? And on that note, I have seen we are now coming up to the hour. So thank you very much for all the questions. It has been, as always, a lot of fun engaging in these debates. So I'm really grateful to people for participating and for turning up. I will watch my email, my inbox, for further submissions and conversations. Great stuff. Thank you very much for attending. This recording will be available online probably next week, later in the week.
Yeah, absolutely, as always. And also along the line, if you need any resources or any links to anything, you can contact either me or Sam. Our inbox is our virtual door and it's always open.
Exactly. Amazing. Thank you very much. Would you like to bring it to a close, Nancy?
Yes, absolutely. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye, folks.